Okay, guys, thank you so much for joining us today. This morning we have with us Dan Stolts, and he's the Chief Technology Strategist for Microsoft. He is the guru in systems management and all the other server-related technologies. And he has 34 years experience in the industry and has been 8 years with Microsoft. With that, I'll leave it up to Dan to further introduce himself.
Great.
Thank you, Dan, for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. You can reach me on my blog, itproguru.com. Email dstolts@microsoft.com, but not the best way to reach me. You can also get me on Twitter at itproguru. So let's dive in. Today's topic is cloud security versus on-prem security. What's better? What's different? Wow, that is a mouthful. You know what? I only have 45 minutes. I can talk really fast. Can you guys listen really fast? Okay, good. No, the reality is I can't possibly cover all of it in 45 minutes. So the approach that I decided to take was touch on a lot of stuff and then go a little bit deeper on a couple of things. Okay, so hopefully you'll learn some cool things today. So let's start with Active Directory. There's a lot of things that I could talk about Active Directory and Active Directory versus Azure Active Directory. I'm going to go a little deep on the Azure Active Directory piece to let you know what's the difference there. But before I do that, I want to just let you know hybrid AD security lifecycle methodology. This is something that you should know, and you'll see on most of my slides I have a link that's going to give you a lot more information. This particular one is an Ignite video from last week. It's an awesome video I would suggest that you go out and read it. It's going to tell you all about that topic. So I'm not going to dive into it. Other things like rights management, OMS, Intune, all things from a security standpoint you kind of need to understand, and it builds that story of what's better about the cloud. This is not a pitch for selling you on the cloud. I understand the audience, and you really want to understand the value of both. What should be on-prem, what should be in the cloud, and where are they different? So as I move on, I'm really kind of focusing on the cloud, but where there's things that don't make sense in the cloud, I'll let you know where those are. In fact, one of those is Active Directory. So Azure Active Directory and Active Directory, I assume most people know that there is a difference between those. And I'll highlight the difference this way. Azure Active Directory was designed for authenticating applications. Active Directory was designed for securing resources. They really have two fundamentally different tasks that they perform. At the root level, they do the same thing. They're authenticating users, granting user access rights to services. Okay? At the core level, they do the same thing. They are a directory. That's why they're both called Active Directory. Azure Active Directory, or the cloud version of Directory, can do so much more than Active Directory. But there's a few things that it can't do that Active Directory does really well. Things like encrypted file system, right? Those things that require Kerberos, Azure Active Directory does not support Kerberos. Okay, so Active Directory is going to be your component there. But the long list of things that the cloud version of Active Directory can do is very, very, very long. I can't possibly talk about it all today. But I'll summarize it this way. A lot of things that you can do in Active Directory, like multi-factor authentication. Anybody ever stood up multi-factor authentication in an Active Directory environment? Who's done that? It is a boatload of work. Usually it requires a third party to get involved to help you do it, in fact. There's usually things like a device that you have to carry around with you. Some of the more advanced ones are using mobile phones and applications. Azure Active Directory, first of all, for those that have Office 365, you already have Azure Active Directory, in case you didn't know that. But it does things like multi-factor authentication out of the box. You know, a few check boxes, a couple of configuration pages, and you're done. In fact, Microsoft, whenever they first introduced dual-factor authentication, you know, when that happened, it was the weekend after the Sony hack. Microsoft, to log into our email, the entire company used to be able to do a single-factor authentication. After that Sony breach, Microsoft flipped a couple of switches in Azure Active Directory and say, we now require dual-factor authentication for all email. That happened over the weekend. 190,000 employees happened over the weekend. Right? It was a pain for us because we had to go do dual-factor authentication whenever we logged in. So if I'm in a conference, I can't just step up to a machine and log in anymore. Now we've changed that, and I can do that now because I have it on my smartphone, and I can authenticate with my smartphone right there on a kiosk. But let me tell you what that advantage is going to give us, what bringing cloud Active Directory into the situation gives us. Not only do you have super simple multi-factor authentication, but what happens in your environment if a user's credentials get compromised? We heard in the last 2 sessions, you probably aren't going to know it, right? You're not going to know that you're compromised. You're not going to know that that user's credentials have been compromised. How would you know it? Let's take a second to think about how would you know, Dan as an employee, how would you know using Active Directory that somebody in India was logging in as me and scouring my network for different things and trying to find stuff? Yeah? Behavioral analysis. Who has behavioral analysis set up on their Active Directory? Okay, why? Because it's a lot of work. Some of the things that you can do in the cloud that are kind of automagic, you can do on-prem. The reality is they're so hard that nobody does them, and so expensive they couldn't afford to do them if they wanted to do them, right? In multi-factor authentication in the cloud, included with that is the ability to log what's going on, right? Hey, Dan just logged in New York, right? He logged in New York at 7 o'clock this morning, but he also logged in India, at 10 o'clock in the morning. Is that physically possible? That was a question. Time travel. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. If I remote control to a machine that happens to be there, so I don't want to automatically block that, but you know what? If that is an anomaly, right? I don't normally log in from India. In fact, I've never logged in from India. So that's an anomaly. Azure Active Directory can see that as an anomaly and automatically force that second factor authentication. The second factor authentication doesn't happen because they don't have access to my cell phone. So then what happens? In an AD world, what happens? Oh well, life goes on. They weren't able to authenticate. Good job, right? But should that be the end of the story? Because what else is the problem that we need to go fix right now? The password needs to be reset. We need to let the user know they need to reset the password. We need to talk to network security and make sure that user has clearly been compromised because the first factor of the authentication was successful, right? Cloud-based security gives you the capability of doing that and so much more. There's things like Microsoft will go out there with some of the enterprise capabilities. They'll go out there and they'll actually scan for email addresses that belong to your domain that are being sold, or credentials that are being sold on the dark web. Right? Lots of things that are built into that cloud foundation that you just simply can't do. You don't have the resources, you don't have the time, you don't have the money, you don't have, frankly, the capability to do some of those things. That doesn't mean you can replace Active Directory with Azure Active Directory. There's a place for both of them. And whenever you start doing that migration, you don't want to just move your Active Directory into the cloud. There's a lot that goes into the decisions around that. I just wanted to share some of the big differences so you understand that there's a lot of learning you have to do as you go down that road. Let's talk a little bit about on-prem. Virtualization. Oh, sorry. I just threw this slide in 5 minutes ago because this was an announcement that happened last week. General availability of encryption service in all public cloud data centers. Could we do encryption on-prem? Pretty easily, right? Turn on BitLocker. Right? Done. Really easy. Up until now, up until literally this last week, that was really hard to do in the cloud. Now we can actually do that. Okay? So some things are easier to do on-prem. Now that's super easy to do in the cloud as well. So that was one of the things that just literally was announced last week. So let's look at security in a cloud-enabled world. What really happens is you're offloading your security burden, parts of your security burden, to your cloud provider. Hopefully that cloud provider is going to be Microsoft. And depending on the type of systems that you're deploying, whether it's infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service. There's different things that are being offloaded. So the blue column here are those things that you're still responsible for. And you see in an on-prem environment, you're responsible for everything. Of course you are. And in fact, people that have recognized that they have been compromised, a lot of them can't get to the cloud fast enough because they recognize that the tons of money that Microsoft spends on security, they can't possibly match, right? So the cloud is far, far, far more secure. And they're offloading that risk to their cloud provider. As you move up the stack into like software as a service or platform as a service, you'll see that the cloud provider is taking on more and more and more responsibility. The data is always going to be your responsibility, right? If you put out junk passwords and then post those passwords on a website somewhere, you've completely put a hole in all of the security that your cloud provider is going to give you. Right? So there's still due diligence that you have to do, but your cloud provider becomes your partner. So, you know, the data is always retained by you in terms of your responsibility, and then as you move down the stack, transfers to the cloud provider. Security by obscurity. How do hackers target an individual company? What's the easy way to find out how to hack on a company? Anybody? Yeah, what's their website, right? What's their website? From their website, what can they get? Their IP address. From their IP address, what can they get? Kind of the IP address of all their servers, because go to both sides of that IP address and you're probably going to hit their servers, right? Anybody have IP addresses that are scattered all over the place in their organization? No, you buy blocks. One person. You buy blocks. And so once they get your website, they can just start attacking those different ports on all those different IP addresses of yours. Really easy. In the cloud, it's not that way. You don't have a reserved block of IP addresses that you're using in the cloud, so your website may be completely different than your mail server. It's going to be completely different than your other servers, right? So you do have a lot of security by obscurity whenever you go to the cloud. We heard earlier in the last couple of presentations that you cannot, there's two kinds of companies, those that have been breached and know it, and those that have been breached and don't know it, right? I totally agree with that. So the new concept with the cloud is you go on the assume breach model. We assume that hackers are getting in. Once they're in, the question becomes is how hard is it for them to do other things? How hard is it for them to go other places and compromise other aspects of the system? So what we want to do is we want to prevent breach, but we also want to assume breach. Another thing that I wanted to highlight, this is more of an on-prem kind of a scenario, where virtualization has added an enormous amount of complexity and, frankly, security gaps into our infrastructure. Things like the virtualization administrators now kind of have God permissions on everything, right? Because they have control of the infrastructure, all of the infrastructure in most cases. There's new technologies that are out now that kind of limit your risk and exposure for these types of people. Same is true for admins, and we're not going to go into a lot of detail on that, but there's a lot of things that you can do both on-prem and in the cloud to protect yourself, your assets from people, and do the segregation of duties. And this is going to be incumbent on you to configure as you're rolling things out to the cloud. And the reason why I say that is because a lot of customers come to me and they're like, want to do the lift and shift. That is, I got VMs running on-prem, I want to move them into the cloud. You know what? The sales guys are trying to get them to do that. Why? Because it's really easy, it's really fast, and it's really low risk. Right? Low-hanging fruit. But the reality is that is not the best action. Because what you're doing, and we'll talk more about this in a minute when we talk about networks, what you're actually doing is you're taking all the on-prem problems that you potentially have and your design that you probably created 30 years ago for your network, and you're carrying that into the cloud, and you're not taking advantage of any of the advantages of the cloud. Perception versus reality. People that are not in the cloud, they perceive that their on-premises is far more secure. Well, the reality is something very, very, very different than that. And as they get into the cloud and they start taking advantages of some of the benefits that they have of the cloud, they really start to understand how much more secure the cloud is than their on-prem was. So let's take a look at just a few things. Network isolation. We're going to go deep. This is one of the areas that we're going to go deeper on today is network isolation. On-prem, it's hard. It's really expensive. It requires multiple networks. It's error-prone. Management, oh my God, it's really hard to do. Hardware, tags, management. Who manages all that stuff? How do you manage all that stuff? How many firewalls do you have to buy? Okay, so you move to a software firewall. Then how do you manage that? How do you centrally manage that? Whenever things change, how do you not break stuff whenever you need to move stuff? There's a lot of issues with network protection or network isolation on-prem. Anybody set up IPsec in their internal networks and you're on-prem? Anybody? One person? Why? Why hasn't everybody done it? It's a no-brainer, right? You should do it. Why? It's really, really hard. And even once you do it, stuff's going to break all the time because it's really even harder to manage. In the cloud, you get some of those capabilities, but it's a lot easier to manage. IP discoverability and ranges, we talked about that already. Custom routes, on-prem, it's very, very hard. What are you doing? You're either setting up rules on your routers and your firewalls, or even worse, you're setting up rules on the local servers that are actually going to be doing the routing. Right? So it's really hard to do. In the cloud, super, super simple. Logical boundaries, on-prem, network switches, routers, network load balancers. Your typical boundary areas. In the cloud, oh my God, there are barriers everywhere. All you have to do is not lift and shift and start using some of those barriers. And we're going to talk a lot about some of those. Scaling to the cloud is really, really, really easy. All you got to do, create a VPN tunnel, start synchronizing services, boom, you're in the cloud, right? Let your users connect to the cloud via 80 or 443, and you're all set, right? But you know what? That's not the best way to do it. It's definitely not the secure way to do it, okay? That's not how you migrate services to the cloud, because all you've done is you're actually creating additional vulnerabilities within your organization, because you're taking all the vulnerabilities that you have on-prem, you're moving them to the cloud, and you're adding additional vulnerability spots, right? So don't do it that way. There's another way to do it. You can set up a VPN tunnel, have a different network, so at least you have boundaries, say around your Active Directory or around other services. So you have some isolation, and that's what a lot of companies are doing now. They're at least doing the minimal isolation capabilities, but it's still not the best way, and we'll talk about some of the best ways as we move on. Some people will say, okay, well, in my environment, I really need to do some kind of synchronization, or I need to have some kind of path to get me to the cloud. It's not going to be a lift and shift and everything goes over the weekend. I got thousands of servers. I got tens of thousands of servers, right? So you need this hybrid approach for different things. And how do you do hybrid in a secure fashion? Well, yeah, you can set up a VPN tunnel, right? How big is your organization and how fast is that going to get saturated? Oh, well, I'll just stand up a couple of VPN tunnels. Again, how fast is that going to get saturated, right? What latency is that going to add to my overall strategy, right? So when you think about these security things, you want to do it without adding a ton of latency. There is Express Route that gives you the capability to extend. We've got gateways, all kinds of technology that's available to you to literally bring your private line directly into Azure Data Center in a low latency type of environment. Okay, so you can look into some of those capabilities. This is where I want to go a little bit deeper. Network security groups. When we talk about network security groups, I want you to think of a network security group as tied to a subnet. Think of it as you can almost think of it as a firewall per subnet. Right? It's a software firewall. Whenever Microsoft stands up a firewall in Azure, in the cloud, what it's really doing is it's standing up a server that is configured as a firewall, and it's delivered to you as a service. Right? Under the covers, there's a computer running that firewall. Right? That's how stuff happens. Okay? But the reality is, it can be done in such an efficient way that on a single piece of hardware, because of virtualization and technologies that are available to us today, that you can run an awful lot of these that are easily configurable on a minimalist set of hardware. And oh, by the way, you're going to get a perfect result every time. Perfect? What's that? Perfect is what happens whenever you have code executing exactly the same every single time. Right? You get rid of user error. You get rid of issues that are brought up by different environments or people configuring in a different way. Right? Everything is completely scripted. And we also want to gain the capabilities of doing, applying, understanding the difference between internal traffic and external traffic and port redirection and port forwarding and load balancers and audits and audit logs and all of that stuff. All of that stuff needs to be built into it. Well, that means I need an advanced firewall, right? I don't just need a router. I need advanced firewall capabilities. But the reality is a network security gateway does give you all that capability because it's just a server running somewhere that's being delivered as software as a service under the platform as a service model, but it's really software as a service because you don't see what's going on underneath the covers. And you can do things like block traffic. So in this case, I'm showing you where I'm blocking traffic from the internet to my back end or my middle tier, and they're only going to have access through the front end. And you'll see that I'm going through a gateway for my on-premises using ExpressRoute and VPNs to access the information on the back end. So I can still do things like management, okay? This is more of a way to do it in a more secure way than what those first pictures laid out for you. So let's talk a little bit about isolation. Isolation. Do we do isolation on premises? How many networks, how many different subnets do you have in your on-prem environment? Right? Some of you have a bunch, some of you have one, some of you have a couple, right? So you have maybe limited capabilities of doing isolation. Why? Because it's hard, because it's a lot of work to set up, because it's a lot of work to manage, right? You don't have the tools to do that effectively or efficiently. In the cloud, just the opposite is true. It's super easy to set up, can be fully scripted, so you don't have to have somebody go in there and be an expert on how to do all of this, and you don't have to, you can have monitoring processes that monitor it all, but you still want to have the capability of users coming in on one port, okay, and having that redirect. You want to be able to have different customers. It's a multi-tenancy environment. So you want to have multiple setups. You want to have multiple applications, multiple deployments. And if one customer is compromised, you don't want it to have an impact on another. Absolutely. So you have all these different layers. You have the network, you have the cloud service, you have the customer, you have the subscription. All of these different components have their own boundaries. Information can only pass through those boundaries that's supposed to pass through those boundaries. You can set it up so you can eliminate those boundaries, you know, by having your applications on a bunch of different networks and then setting up VPNs between those networks in the cloud. You can absolutely do that. It's actually a lot harder to do that because it's more steps for you to do it wrong, right? A better way to do it is to stand up a network, stand up the cloud services, stand up the environment so that you have those silos and you have those automatic isolation points as you build out your infrastructure. So to drill in on this a little bit, so a client tries to connect via a service on 1092. They're going to get redirected to a particular deployment or particular server, and that's going to get translated to 3389 for RDP, or 443 is going to come in on 443, so you're not messing up any of your secure HTTP. You have RDP endpoints at 1013 that's coming in on a different client that's going to a different virtual subnet that's going to a different deployment. Right? You have complete isolation through that private network. These don't have to be different customers. They could be different services for the same customer. Right? So this can be figured in any way that you want. So you as a business can set up isolations in your business just like you do in AD. You know, in AD, you have different OUs for different businesses or different departments or different functions. You have that same capability within your network, and it's very easy to do. Did I mention that it's very easy to do? Okay, I'm going to show you just how easy it is, or I'm going to prove how easy it's not, depending on your perspective, whenever I get into the demo in just a minute. But I do want to mention this. Isolating VMs within a virtual network for defense in depth. Right? Notice that I have I'm going to call it the network security group. Just think of that as a firewall in every different aspect, wherever I want it. You know, I can go through load balancers. I can prevent traffic going into the network. I can prevent traffic coming in on different ports or whatever. Very easy to do. So let's talk about automation very quickly. Whenever you move into the cloud, one of the things that I want to do is I want to talk about the term DevOps. DevOps, if you haven't dived into DevOps, I strongly encourage you to do that. One of the core tenets of DevOps is automation, or simplifying processes and getting rid of things like human error, getting rid of bottlenecks in the system, right? That's what DevOps is all about. So one of the things that I subscribe to is pretty much automate wherever you can, automate everywhere. So one of the things you're going to want to do as you automate everywhere, though, is pay attention to some things, right? So the creation of roles and accounts within your servers, creation of SSH keys, understanding what is automated, test and verify, compliancy, right? There's other things that you're going to have to consider as you start looking at the cloud, so that it's not. I'm not saying that you turn a couple of keys and you're done. What I'm telling you is you can turn a couple of keys and you're done, but you're not done right. You're not done right until you do your homework and understand all the complexities involved with making all of this stuff a reality. So infrastructure automation, quickly onboarding new team members, easily reprovisioning, parallelization of work, model for real-world consumption. Right? I talk to companies now. I talk to so many companies now, and they're actually companies that have never been in the software business are now looking at delivering their services as a software solution. It's just absolutely incredible. Let me give you just a quick example. A company that I used to work with a lot, SalesLogix. What we did is a CRM application where I was an integrator or I was a system designer. I would go out and I would spend weeks, sometimes months, designing a system with meetings with the customer every week, sometimes multiple times a week, sometimes marathon meetings, 4 hours at a pop. We were charging hundreds of thousands of dollars, sometimes in excess of $1 million for these systems. Then we'd go away and we'd build it all, and 6 months later we'd come back and install it all, show them all how to use it and all that stuff. The downside to that is really, really, really expensive for customers to do that model, right? So really long sales cycle. You make a lot of money, but it's also technical talent, bringing in the technical talent that can do those kinds of things. But what about today? Whenever I can turn on automation, I can say, deliver that same service that used to take me a year plus to design and deliver for a customer, and now I can have them provide it to themselves as a self-service SaaS model, and all I've got to do is maybe spend that time once to build it for myself, that I can have the customer automatically stand it up on their own. I can still add additional services for customization and stuff like that if I want to be able to do that. But what used to cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars to even try it, I'm now allowing them to try it for free. Maybe I'm free for 30 days, free for 90 days. What is that going to do to my ability to bring in new business? We were a consulting firm. Now we can, even if the software provider is not doing that, we can, as a service provider, go in and offer that service, right? Fundamentally changing, the cloud is fundamentally changing the way businesses think about delivering services. Any tasks that are repetitive or complex tasks are great for automation. So let's take a look at the networks, network real quick. So what I've got here is I've got an Azure virtual machine. Actually, I don't even have any virtual machines on. I have a virtual network, and I want to show you what it would take to do something that's kind of hard, right? It is taking Azure SQL database and Azure storage. I want this network to not communicate with the internet, but to only communicate with those devices. Think about this. That means I have to know what IP address of my SQL server is, right? I have to know what IP address my Azure storage account is. There are literally hundreds of IP addresses that Azure will use, and they automatically move stuff at will, and they don't notify me before they move it. How would you configure that kind of a scenario on-prem? Really hard to do. Months. I see somebody laughing. That means they probably had to do something like that. Takes a lot of time, and you know what? Very error prone. Now, let me show you how I would do that in the cloud. I have a little script. Actually, you know what? I'm going to go, I was looking for what am I going to do to show that. I said, let me do something hard. Let me do something that's going to require a whole lot of steps and show you how that can be automated. So I'm talking about network security. I'm talking about automation at the same time. And so I said, okay, this is what I want to do. And then the first thing I did is I went out to Bing and I said, you know, who's done this before? Let me steal their code, right? Like the second link or the first link was this blog post. Keith Mayers, a good friend of mine. Okay, known him since he started at Microsoft a few years ago. And he literally walked me through I had to tweak his script a little bit because it wasn't exactly what I wanted to do, but 90% of it was there of what I wanted to do. So it took me about an hour and a half to tweak his script to work in my demo environment. And this is what I came up with. I have a script. So the first thing that I want to do, actually let me show you the portal first. So if I go to Azure here, what you'll see is I have this resource group. The resource group that I'm on is an example resource group. And in that resource group, I have this allow Azure out. This is the network security group. I have this example VNet, which is my VNet, and I have a storage account on there. Those are the resources that I have on there. Those are the resources that I want to work with in this example. So what I'm going to do is if I go in here and I look at this network security group and I look at the details on it, it'll show me kind of what's in there now. So I have 0 inbound rules and I have 26 outbound rules defined in here. And this is what they all look like. I have a bunch of allows and then I have one deny at the end. Okay? So now, if I were to do that, could I do that through the graphical user interface? Absolutely. It would be the same problem that I have on-prem, right? It's hard to do. Okay? I can do that, though, in the cloud with a script. So PowerShell is my script of choice. I love it. Been working with it for years. And this is probably 100 lines of code, but the reality is I could do the same thing in about 10 lines of code. The reason I've done it this way is to make it easy for you to use if you wanted to use, so that you can use pop-up GUIs for selection and stuff like that. So I'm going to go ahead and log into my Azure. And you'll see my multi-factor authentication pop up. In my case, I have a, I don't have my smart card plugged in. Yep, I don't have I'm going to try to do my phone. This one may fail. Yeah, you want to bring me a reader? That'll be easier. So let me see. Am I logged in? I might already still be logged in. So let me see. Because if I am, then that's a lot easier. Yeah, I'm already logged in, so I don't need it. Thank you. So I'm already logged in, but there's one line to log in, and I don't have my smart card reader plugged in, so that's why. And this is a brand new machine. I just got it 2 days ago, and I haven't set up a virtual smart card, which is what I'd ultimately do. So I selected my subscription through a graphical user interface, and then I'm going to set my subscription to that one that I just selected. Now I'm going to go out and select which resource group I want to tie this network security group to. And again, I'm going to do that from a graphical user interface, so an extra couple lines of code to do that. So I'm going to select the example resource group. Say OK. Now, this is where it gets interesting, because now I got to look at the IP addresses that I want to add to this rule. Okay? So I know that Microsoft advertises what IP addresses they use. So I'm going to go out and I'm going to look at what IP addresses they are. I'm just going to show you what I'm going to be downloading. and I'm going to go ahead and open this XML. So this is an XML that has by region all the IP addresses, all the subnets, and subnet ranges for each region. And you'll see this is where US East starts. So I'm going to go down and I'm going to read that document and parse it and put it into a set of variables. Okay, so that's what these lines are doing. And then it's just going to print out a list of those regions. Okay, that's all done. Now I'm going to select the region, because all I've done is I've grabbed a list of all the regions and all the IP addresses. Now I'm going to select the region that I want to limit to, and let's do Asia East. Okay. And now let's go ahead and set up those IP address ranges and create the rules. And just for performance reasons, I cut this. You know what? We had 26 in there. Let me change this to, say, 20, so we can see that it actually overwrote because we had 26 in there before, and now we'll have less, so it's going to overwrite the one we have. So let's go ahead and run all of this and execute. Uh-oh.
Did you lose a parenthesis after the 20?
Yep, I'm not used to this keyboard. You're right, thank you. Good call. So this is going to go through the first 20 kind of slow, because as it's going out there and it's querying all of the details on all of those. And then after that, it went really fast to get to the 87 to give me 88. The reason it went really fast is because I'm not actually adding it. I shortcutted that just so that I could get through it a lot faster. And you'll see that I have 20 rules out of 88 rules that were in there. And now let's go ahead and create the rules. Okay? So I'm going to go create those rules. Single command to do that. Now I'm going to create the network security group. There's already a network security group out there called that. Do you want to override it? I'm going to say yes. It's still running. So what it's doing is it's going out there and creating that network security group and attaching all of those rules to it. And there it goes. It's finally done. That's the longest step because it's creating all those rules out in Azure. So this is now I need to tie it to my network. So which network do I want to tie it to? Okay. Now I need to say, okay, within that network, which subnet do I want to tie it to? Okay, I'm going to attach it to my example subnet. And then I'm going to go out there and configure the network security, or configure the network to attach that network security group to it. So I'm going to go ahead and run that. All that does is links the network and the subnet that I selected to the network security group. Okay, so now if I go back into Azure, let me go back to my network security group. Let me just do a refresh on this page. Twenty-one outbound rules, and you'll see actually if you took a snapshot, you'll see that the IP addresses are different because I chose a different region, okay, or different. I chose Asia East instead of, I think the prior one was US East, okay. So what I've shown you is network security groups and how you can set those up and manage those via script through automation very, very easily. So some of you are thinking, yeah, but I'm not a PowerShell guy, Dan. What took you, an hour is going to take me 2 days. Yeah, it might. Unless you learn how to use Bing, and then it's probably going to take you 4 hours instead of, an hour or 2. But the reality is, after you start getting used to automating things, this is going to become easier and easier and easier and easier, and you've got so many other advantages. Okay. So let's pop back over into slides. There's a few other things I want to talk about. DevOps. Developers, operations means IT operations. That's us. Okay. Working together. Quick story. I was working with a developer on a project for a customer a couple weeks ago, and I assigned him the task of I was the assistant, I was the architect on the solution. I assigned him with the task of going out and creating some stuff for delivery to the customer. He went out, spent a couple days, created. It was a simple project. He went out and created it, and then he delivered it to me. And I went to install it, and guess what? Didn't work. It crashed. I sent him a copy of the screenshot. He said, I don't know what's wrong. It's clearly your environment. You need to fix your environment, and it'll run fine. So I looked at my environment for about 4 hours, and I couldn't find the problem. So I called up a couple of my peers. Hey, run this script. The same thing that I got from the developer. I said, go, do me a favor, go spend 20 minutes to install this and get it running. That person couldn't do it. So I sent it to another person. Said, take this program from the developer and run it. See if you can get it running in your environment. They couldn't get it running either. So it's running in one environment, the developer's environment. Does that solve my problem? Do I have any confidence that I'm going to go deliver that to the customer and it's going to work? No. That's not DevOps. That's not developers and operations working together. That's developers throwing code over the wall. It gets worse because this guy didn't understand the concept of DevOps. So my resulting factor was I needed to get this done. I was on a tight timeline. I threw his code away. I went out and spent 3 days over the weekend rewriting the whole thing myself. I found the problem with his code, and it actually ended up being that in my account key in Azure, there was a /. And the / was breaking it, but it wasn't giving me that error message. It was giving me a BS message like the name that you provided doesn't match the resource manager template. It's like there's nothing wrong with the name, right? The problem was with the key. And I did some more research, and I found that about 80% of the account keys that you create in Azure have a /. So he must have been one of that 20% that didn't happen to have a / in his, right? This kind of stuff happens all the time. It's incumbent on us to change our organization, change our way of thinking, so that working together collaboratively to solve the business needs and deliver solutions to customers. The best book I've ever read by far, let me rephrase that, the best technology-related book that I've ever read by far is this one. And I'm giving you access to it for free if you've not had somebody, what is it, Shift F5 to so on this, if you go to this URL, a.co/whatever that number is, take a picture of it if you want, you get a free audio book of this book. I know most of the people in this room are security professionals, so you might get discouraged because John, who is the security professional in the story, this is a story about a company that was dysfunctional and how I won't give you any the bottom line, either they went out of business, they sold the IT operations to a third party, or they became successful. I'll let you figure out what the end of the story is. As you go through that story, John was the security officer. He totally got a bum deal. But you know what? That's pretty typical in business. So I thought it was apropos. So don't get discouraged and put the book down because you're pissed that John's getting a bum deal, because John does land on his feet at the end. But go read this book. You'll fully understand the concept of DevOps, and then turn your projects into successes like they show you how to do at the end. A lot of the stuff, a lot of the lessons that are in the book are not clear until you get to the last couple pages. Don't read the last couple pages first. It spoils the whole book. But do finish it even though the first couple chapters are a little boring. So practice DevOps wherever possible. Think about it, people, processes, and technology. And, you know, I'm out of time, so there's so much other stuff that I would love to talk about. And all these slides are available on my blog at itproguru.com. /resources. It's the first link up there. There's a lot of differences between on-prem and cloud, and most of them are a really awesome and compelling story. So I would encourage you to do that. I do want to talk about one last thing, though, and that is containers. Containers is a brand new technology. Well, it's been around for about 5 years. Docker has made it a name. Docker's made containers kind of mainstream. And Microsoft with Windows Server 2016 has launched their own Docker-compatible version of containers. They're also available as a cloud service. Let me tell you real quickly the difference between how things used to work and how things are going to work in the near future. If you look at session-based computing, you have all of the users running on one operating system, all of the applications running on that operating system. Very, very, very efficient, right? But not very secure, right? And that's one of the challenges with it is you can't give users you can't give user admin rights because they're on the machine with everybody else, right? You have to manage security at file level and folder level and all that. So there's a lot of security implications with session-based computing, even though it's very efficient. When we move into virtual machines, and I'll also say VDI is exactly the same way, very inefficient, but you have these extra security boundaries. In a virtual machine, the virtual machine itself is an isolation point. But you have massive amounts of overhead. That massive overhead is associated with disk I/O, memory, CPU, OS, licenses, the works. Why is that a problem? Right? Instead of having one host operating system, I've got 50 operating systems all running. In case you guys didn't know, even if the user's not doing anything in Windows, Windows is working hard. It's chugging the CPU, it's chugging the memory, it's really chugging the disk, right? Add all that up on one server, a lot of overhead. So this is, it's a lot more work and it's a lot of overhead, but it is better isolation and it's a huge cost because of all of the overhead. Whenever we move into containers, we get the best of both worlds. We get a single OS solution that's customized for the application, and you have isolation around every single one of them. Okay? If you take that one step further, because one of the things that's with a container is it's dependent on the operating system that's running. So if you add in technologies like virtualization, where you can have one stack that's running on Windows, another stack that's running in a VM on Linux, and you have isolation around all those applications. It's the best of both worlds. This technology has already started taking our market by storm. If you've not looked into it, you need to, because this is the next thing that's going to really impact our data centers much, much more than virtualization ever did or could hope to. Thank you all very much for your time. I appreciate it, and hope you enjoy the conference. Again, the slide deck, itproguru.com/resources.
I need a couple minutes, guys. Thank you very much, Dan.
Right.
Really appreciate your time today.
Thanks.
Microsoft is conducting a survey